Hello, welcome to Making Thinking Visible with Hexagonal Thinking. I'm Kate Meyer. I am one of 5 MLTI ambassadors working for the Maine State Department of Education. My job as an ambassador is to provide instructional coaching and professional learning around digital citizenship, technology integration, and digital instructional design to teachers in the state of Maine. My role as an MLTI ambassador is a 2-year position. So all 5 of us were in the field as educators last year. Prior to my work as an MLTI ambassador, I spent 21 years as an English teacher and a design thinking teacher, mainly at Mount Desert Island High School in Bar Harbor. And when my 2-year appointment as an MLTI ambassador is finished, I will return back to my classroom. I'm so excited that you're here today to learn about hexagonal thinking. So, in 30 minutes or less, we are going to cover these 3 topics. We're going to talk about what hexagonal thinking is, how to introduce hexagonal thinking to your students, and then I'll talk a little bit about other ways to use hexagonal thinking in your classes and share some resources that will get you started. So, what is hexagonal thinking? Hexagonal thinking is not new. This brainstorming technique was created by 2 British creativity and organizational consultants who actually use the strategy to drive innovation and connect ideas in new ways in the field of marketing. So it's out there in the business world. Unlike other brainstorming techniques that you might be familiar with that focus on generating ideas, hexagonal thinking requires that learners make connections between ideas and explore those nuances between the connections. Hexagonal thinking in the classroom is a visual discussion strategy that makes students' thinking visible while giving them a chance to think about things in new ways and to make connections between ideas that they might not normally make. Hexagonal thinking is also a really playful way for students to engage with content and to practice the 4 C's. I discovered hexagonal thinking a few years ago when I started doing book clubs in my American literature class. And at that point, I was really listening to the podcast Spark Creativity by Betsy Potash. And she's mainly focused on ELA content, but her podcast does cover a lot of topics that can span across the content areas, as you'll see in today's presentation. So my students and I were having trouble beginning and maintaining thoughtful conversations that focused on the text when they were working in small groups. You've probably experienced something similar. So when I was right by a group, standing right next to them, they would be able to hold a conversation. But as soon as I would start to walk away, it would kind of fall apart. So I was realizing that as I moved about the classroom, I might be standing next to a group hearing great things, but all of the groups around me weren't exactly sure what they should be doing if I wasn't right there, and they were really struggling. One of my goals for my students is that they can hold text-based discussions without me. So I really needed a strategy that scaffolded this in a way that helped us all meet our goals. So I tried hexagonal thinking as a way to help them, and it really transformed the way that they held discussion. And I think it was because it put the power in their hands. So with hexagonal thinking, all I did was give them a few words or phrases or topics that related to the text that they were working on, which was the perfect amount of structure from me. And it gave them the flexibility and freedom that really helped their conversations take off. So after that first experience with hexagonal thinking, I became a firm and true believer in this strategy and the power that this very simple strategy has in the classroom. This is an example of a hexagonal thinking map. It all begins with hexagons that contain keywords, ideas, concepts, images, GIFs, video. I say whatever you can find and fit on a hexagon from your unit and lesson is a great idea to put on a hexagon. Of course, this activity can be done with paper. Hexagons, I've seen teachers use cardboard hexagons or laminated hexagons, but the advantage to doing this digitally is that it offers the students so many ways to communicate their ideas and allows them to express themselves in GIFs and videos and images and hyperlinks. So what you're looking at here is a hexagonal thinking map that is completed about the crucible. So you'll see I've got the author's name, I've got some thematic terms like corruption and power, I've got the idea of McCarthyism, some character names. I've got a GIF from the film. And so my students would recognize the scene. It's a scene where the girls all claim that they are seeing a bird in the courtroom and everyone really loses it. I've got some images. So an image of a crucible, an image of the scales of justice. And then you'll see there are some arrows in here as well. And this is where students decide which connections they want to explain further because they think that they're really interesting. So you can see that put together, it does create this hexagonal map, and every side, of course, the hexagon is touching represents a connection. This activity provides a springboard for a really creative and in-depth discussion. And again, the first time I did this with my students, I was blown away at actually how quickly it really forced them to make their conversations quite deep. Because as the students were going through the terms and the images and the GIFs and thinking about how they were going to connect them, they were turning to their notes, they were turning to their text, they turned to their peers for discussion, and really worked to support the connections that they were making. And really, ideally, what started to happen is they started to actually ask their peers to defend their choices of connections and dig deep in kind of a miniature debate sort of conversation style. When it comes to hexagonal thinking, the really great thing about it is that there is no right answers. So the students can dive into those debates and defenses as they are working on their hexagonal thinking maps. There are so many unique ways to connect ideas that this activity also can really be a confidence builder for your students, because again, there's no right or wrong way to do this. So I'd like to talk about the 4Cs for a second and why hexagonal thinking is such a rich strategy to use in your classroom. Teachers have been working on focusing classroom climate around collaboration and cooperation. We know that collaboration skills are crucial for our students. This strategy gives us the chance to do collaborative learning and to guide our students as they boost their social and emotional cue awareness. With hexagonal thinking, students have to explain how these concepts are connected. The defense comes out in the conversation. The placement of the hexagons and what they choose to include, if you have them co-author hexagons with you, exercises their creativity as they work to make connections that others might not immediately see. It's a really great way to teach the 4Cs through micro lessons. So I might do a 2-minute micro lesson on whatever skill I see that my students need to practice. I might remind them of the skill, for example, respectfully disagreeing with each other. And we talk about what that looks like in the context of the day's activity. And then you, as the teacher, get to enjoy listening to the conversation and coaching them on the skills that you are practicing while they are doing the hexagonal thinking. So let's look at a basic way to introduce your students to hexagonal thinking. I start off with what I consider to be a very basic hexagonal thinking activity. I give them a set of hexagons. So that's what you're looking at here. This is what the students would get. I use Google Slides, but there are a lot of different ways that you can do this activity. I give them the terms that I want them to explore. So you'll see down the left-hand side, terms from a science unit. And I give them some arrows so that they can point out the connections that they would like to explain further. So all of these things are movable. The students can move them all around to make that map. I explain to them that it is their task as a small group to connect the hexagons into a map. I do show them an example the very first time, just like that crucible example that I showed you. And then I just step back and allow them to work together to make the connections. I also stress that there's no right way to do it, that it is a collaborative process, and I want them discussing the possibilities and working together to land on where these hexagons might connect. And then I ask them to choose, in this case, 3 connections. Of course, those are the arrows that they will develop further. Sometimes we do that in writing or video or audio, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides. Really, when you introduce hexagonal thinking to your students, your goal is to encourage them to use their critical thinking skills to make connections amongst ideas, and then to discuss and/or debate the possibility of those and other connections. So this is what you might see at the end of a hexagonal thinking activity. You can see the students who did this one changed the colors of some hexagons to make other connections. So they're starting to represent their ideas in colors. They can also change the size. You know, once you tell them really that the sky is the limit, they will start creating things that will surprise you. And so you'll see they have pointed out 3 connections that they want to explain further. And the very first time that I do this, I give them this very simple template. It's just the next slide after their map, where they take those 3 connections and explain their thinking. So in a few sentences, explain that connection, why those 2 hexagons are touching each other. Of course, it doesn't have to be done in writing. It can be done on video. I actually also really love Flipgrid for this explanation, but they can also use video platforms that are built into their devices, or video platforms that you already use in your classroom. It can be done with audio. I've had students create podcasts, discussing their hexagonal thinking maps. So really, the sky is the limit. Whatever works for you and your students and helps you meet your class's goals is totally open here. So this is just the example of a written reflection. Maybe everyone has to describe the same 3 connections, or maybe the students split it up so that each student in the group is describing the connections. There are a lot of ways to get creative with this. This could be a full-on summative assessment. It could also work as an exit ticket for a formative assessment. You can see, because the explanations are short, that, each student could pick one connection, jot it down as an exit ticket, and then turn it in on their way out the door. I also add a self-reflection piece to every assessment that I do. I work with mainly juniors, so we talk a lot about the metacognitive process, and how I think that the metacognitive piece of school is perhaps one of the most important pieces. It's what's going to help them develop as lifelong learners. So I really don't scrimp with the reflective piece. At this point, by the time we're doing hexagonal thinking, they've gotten lots of models and lots of practice. So my students are really used to these questions. And I do have like 6 or so questions that I mix up and use all semester long. So let's look at some other ways that I use hexagonal thinking in my classroom that might generate some ideas for really creative ways for you to use it in yours. The first is for brainstorming. So I do teach design thinking, which involves a lot of brainstorming, but I also use brainstorming in my ELA classes. So for example, I might give every student 5 hexagons, give them a topic that we're going to brainstorm around, and then set a timer for 5 minutes with the instructions that they are to brainstorm, putting one idea on one hexagon. So at the end of the 5 minutes, they should have 5 hexagons with 5 different ideas. And then I can put them into small groups where they can discuss their ideas and create their hexagonal thinking maps. So that's really great, because the students are generating ideas individually in a brainstorm, and then they're coming together to talk about how all those ideas connect. I also love to use hexagonal thinking to introduce a new concept. I love the old KWL chart. I'm a huge fan. So if you're not familiar with that model, it is know, want, learn. So before you start a new unit, you would ask the students, what do you already know about this topic? What would you like to know? So what do you want to know is the W, and then the L is for what they have learned. So what am I might do in this model is, prior to starting a unit, do a big brainstorm with hexagons where they're putting down what they know and what they want to know, and then getting them into small groups, having them create their hexagonal thinking map. And then as we go through the unit, we stop every day or so to add what it is that they are learning, the L. And the really cool thing is that if you do this one digitally, you can watch how the hexagonal thinking map grows and changes throughout the entire unit. And it's really great to watch what the students do with this one. This is also a fantastic activity for reviewing for a test. So you can give the students key terms or concepts that are going to appear on the test, or they can provide key terms and concepts, maybe co-authoring with you, and then having them work in small groups again to create that hexagonal thinking map. But again, they're using kinesthetic learning because they're moving the hexagons around, and they're having deep discussions about each of the concepts. So it works perfectly as a test review because they're having conversations and using their bodies, which all help with memory, of course, retention. I've also used it to set class norms. So maybe every student gets 3 to 5 hexagons. I give them some prompts about what it is that we are trying to create for norms in our class. Individually, they come up with their ideas. They work in a small group to arrange and discuss. And then as a whole class, we can discuss what's important to us. So they've, again, had that chance to think individually. They've had a chance to come together as a small group, and then they've had a chance to move together as a large group toward an action. It also works really well as a jigsaw activity. It's actually one of my favorite ways. What I'm about to describe takes me about a week. So it's not a short one class activity, but last semester I used the text, The Outliers. And so if there are 8 chapters in a book, I have small groups or medium groups maybe of 8 students. Each student in that group reads a chapter of the text. I then put the students into what we call expert groups. So everybody who read chapter 1 is in a group, everyone who read chapter 2 is in a group, and so on. They work together to discuss what was important from their chapter, what they want to teach all the others who didn't read their chapter. And then they move into presentation groups, which consist of one chapter, one student from the book per chapter. So you've got a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then after they do all of that work and discussion, those presentation groups decide what goes on the hexagons from the book. What are the important key ideas and concepts, and then they create their hexagonal thinking map as a way to discuss and synthesize the whole text. And again, like I said, that's a week-long activity in my class, but that's a great way to use hexagonal thinking. I also love to use hexagonal thinking to get feedback. So I might ask the students to reflect on something that we've been doing in class, give every individual 3 hexagons, ask them to put one piece of feedback per hexagon, then work in small groups again to create that hexagonal thinking map. So now they're discussing the feedback that they're going to give me, and then giving me that feedback at the end once they've had those very rich discussions. It also works really well for peer feedback. So my students work in writing groups when they're working on writing. So there are 3 or 4 students per group, which means when it's time to do a peer review, each paper gets 3 or 4 additional eyes on it. And so again, you can give out hexagons and have students put their feedback on a hexagon. And when they are done, they give their hexagons to the author of the paper. And then the author of that paper can arrange the hexagons into the hexagonal thinking map individually, and then think about what it is that they need to do for their next steps in terms of revision and editing. Of course, hexagonal thinking can be a standalone assessment with writing, or like I said, or a video or a podcast explanation. Another great thing to do with hexagonal thinking is that after the small groups have completed a map, you can say, okay, each individual now is going to add 2 hexagons to your group's map, and then you're going to explain the hexagons that you added and why you made those connections. So there are lots of ways to use hexagonal thinking in your courses. Really, the sky's the limit here. Like I said, if you can fit it on a hexagon, it works for hexagonal thinking. So here's some resources that I have put together for you so that you can get started right away if you would like using hexagonal thinking in your classroom. The first 2 links do link back to the work of Betsy Potash and her Spark Creativity podcast and blog. I'm a huge fan. I think you should definitely check her out. The first link goes to her explanation of hexagonal thinking. And if you sign up for her newsletter at the bottom of the page, she will send you a free digital hexagonal thinking toolkit, so you'll be ready to go. If you'd like to create your own, like I did, there is a link to a video, how to create digital hexagonal thinking templates. It's a very short video, and it will have you creating your own templates quickly and easily. I have linked up an article for you called 3 Secrets to Low Prep Hexagonal Thinking. That will give you some more ideas that you might want to explore. We also have a hexagon generator. So if you're going to do this activity on paper, maybe that's what you do for the first time that you try it out. Going to this site will prompt you to enter in terms, and then it will generate a document for you that is filled with hexagons with the terms right in there. And then you or the students can cut those hexagons out. And the final link, because I am not a huge fan of cutting out all of these hexagons by hand, is a link to the Fisker's Hexagon Squeeze Punch, which I discovered when I was doing this activity for the very first time in my class, and it is a sanity saver for sure. So thank you so much for coming to Making Thinking Visible with Hexagonal Thinking. I'm going to be putting a link to these slides in the description of the video. And so you can see here on this final slide that there is a link to the feedback form and the PD certificate for your hours. So as when you complete the feedback form and submit it, the next screen will give you a link to your certificate where you can go and put your name in and print it off or save it electronically. So thank you so much for coming. Please do reach out if you have any questions or want to explore this idea further with me, and have a great afternoon.